The gun was already pressed against Nelson Hunter's temple before he even had time to register the cold weight of the barrel against his skin. You think you can just ride into Caldwell, trade off stolen horses, and walk away clean. The man behind the weapon was thick-necked, red-faced, and wearing a deputy's badge that caught the dying afternoon light. "We got a description of you, Hunter. We got witnesses." Nelson kept his hands exactly where they were, flat on the trading post counter, fingers spread wide so nobody could mistake his intentions. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice came out steady as bedrock. "Those horses were legitimately purchased from a man named Dalton outside of Wichita. I've got a bill of sale in my left breast pocket. Dalton's a liar and a horse thief himself. That's between you and Dalton." The trading post had gone deathly silent. Nelson was aware of the other patrons pressing back against the rough timber walls, aware of the smell of tallow candles and dried tobacco, aware of the way his own pulse thudded at the base of his throat. But the thing he was most aware of, the thing that hit him like a fist square between the eyes, was the woman standing 3 feet to his left, completely still, watching the deputy with a gaze so calm and calculating it barely seemed human. She was slight in frame but carried herself like someone who had learned long ago that shrinking only invited predators. Her dark hair was pinned back beneath a practical bonnet that had seen better days, and there was a smudge of trail dust across her left cheekbone that she had clearly not bothered to wipe away. In her right hand she held a trade ledger, and in her left she held an expression of absolute controlled fury. "Deputy Crane," she said. Her voice was low, precise, and had the kind of quiet authority that could silence a room without ever raising itself. "That man's bill of sale is genuine. I processed the companion paperwork myself at this counter 11 days ago when Dalton came through selling 3 bays and a roan. Your description doesn't match. Let him go." The deputy's eyes slid toward her and something in them changed, not softened, sharpened with a different kind of menace. "Stay out of this, Bessie. This is my trading post, Vernon. Everything that happens inside it is my business." Nelson took that half-second of divided attention and stepped smoothly away from the gun barrel, putting 2 feet of space between himself and the deputy without a single sudden movement. He kept his hands visible, but he was no longer at the mercy of that cold metal circle against his skull. And in that moment, meeting the woman's eyes across the tense, smoky air of the trading post she apparently owned and ran, Nelson Hunter felt something shift inside his chest that he had absolutely no language for. He had ridden into Caldwell, Kansas, on a Tuesday in the late spring of 1882 with the sole intention of trading 4 horses, collecting payment, and riding back out before sunset. He had a cattle drive to catch up with north of Abilene and no time whatsoever for complications. What he got was something else entirely. The town of Caldwell in 1882 sat right on the edge of the Cherokee Strip, the last major cattle town before the Texas herds crossed into Kansas proper, and it wore its rough edges like a badge of pride. The streets were wide enough for 2 wagons to pass with room to spare, packed earth rutted by 1,000 iron-shod wheels, and the buildings that lined them ranged from solid 2-story brick mercantiles to leaning plank-sided establishments that looked like one good prairie wind might finish them off for good. It was the kind of town that attracted traders, cowboys, gamblers, and men who needed to become someone slightly different than who they had been the week before. Nelson Hunter had not intended to become anyone different. He was 31 years old, born in Missouri and hardened by nearly a decade of cattle work across Texas, Kansas, and the Indian Territory, and he had long since made his peace with the particular kind of life that left no room for permanence. He owned 4 good horses, the gear on his back, a bedroll, and a Colt single-action Army revolver that he cleaned more devotedly than he had ever cleaned anything else in his life. He did not own land. He did not own a house. He did not own any of the anchors that made men stay in places they had chosen, and up until the moment he rode into Caldwell, that fact had suited him perfectly. He had heard about Redmond's trading post from another drover named Caleb outside of Medicine Lodge, who had mentioned it the way men mentioned anything reliable in that country, briefly, and with a kind of reverence reserved for things that actually worked. Bessie Redmond runs a straight trade, Caleb had said, pushing the brim of his hat back with one finger. Better prices than Hartley's down on the South End, and she doesn't shortchange you on the scales. Her father ran the place for 20 years before he passed, and she kept every good habit he had. Nelson had filed that information away the way he filed most useful information, practically and without sentiment, and when his route brought him within 8 miles of Caldwell, he had swung northeast without a second thought. He had expected a trading post. He had expected a transaction. He had not expected Bessie Redmond. The deputy named Vernon Crane held his position for another long, ugly moment, the gun still in his hand though no longer pressed to anyone's head, his eyes moving between Bessie and Nelson, with the calculation of a man deciding how much this particular confrontation was worth to him. Then he holstered the weapon with a sharp snap and pointed a thick finger at Nelson. "I'm watching you," he said. "You've got until morning to conclude your business and get moving." "I plan to be gone well before morning," Nelson said. Crane made a sound that was not quite a word and pushed through the trading post door into the late afternoon light, letting it bang shut behind him. The sound of his boots on the porch steps faded, and the other patrons in the trading post let out a collective, quiet breath and went back to their own business as though nothing had happened, with the practiced ease of people who had seen scenes like this before. Nelson turned to look at the woman again. She had already turned back to her counter, setting the ledger down with a precise, deliberate motion, and was straightening a stack of receipt papers that did not particularly need straightening. Her jaw was set. There was a faint tension in her shoulders that had not been there before the deputy arrived, or perhaps it had been there, and he simply had not noticed it. "Thank you," Nelson said. "Don't thank me," she replied, not looking up. "Thank Dalton for keeping decent records. I recognized his handwriting on your paperwork from across the room. That was the only reason you're not currently face down in the street." Nelson leaned one elbow on the counter. "You can recognize a man's handwriting from across the room." She looked up then, and her eyes were a shade of dark brown that was almost black in the trading post's interior light. They assessed him with the same calm intelligence he had seen her turn on the deputy, and they found him neither dangerous nor particularly impressive in the first 3 seconds of that assessment, which was, in Nelson's experience, not a common reaction. "I process several hundred transactions a year, Mr. Hunter. I make it my business to know the handwriting of every regular trader within a 50-mile radius. Dalton's got a particular slant to his sevens." She picked up her pen. "Now, you wanted to trade 4 horses. Bring them around to the back corral and let me look them over. I'll give you a fair price, same as I give everyone." It should have been that simple. Nelson brought the horses around. They were good animals, 2 chestnuts and 2 grays, all sound-legged and well-muscled, bought legitimately from a stock dealer outside Wichita and driven south to catch the trade market before the summer heat made long drives miserable. Bessie walked the corral with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had been assessing horseflesh since childhood, running her hands along their legs, checking their teeth, watching them move. She did not talk while she worked. She did not fill the air with unnecessary words. She simply looked and touched and thought, and Nelson found himself watching her the way he sometimes watched a particularly skilled roper, with the involuntary admiration that competence always produced in him. "I'll give you $32 a head," she said finally, standing at the center of the corral with her hands on her hips. "The 2 grays are worth closer to 35, but the right chestnut has a soft spot developing on his near foreleg that's going to need watching, and it brings the average down." Nelson had been planning to ask $30. He had figured to negotiate up to 31 if he pushed hard. The offer of 32 was either genuinely fair or an opening gambit, and he stood there for a moment deciding which. "I'll take 33 for the pair of grays and 31 for the chestnuts," he said. "Split the difference on the chestnut's leg." She considered this for precisely 3 seconds. Done. They shook hands over it, her grip firm and brief, and she turned back toward the trading post with the efficient stride of someone whose day was already spoken for 10 times over. Nelson stood in the corral with the late afternoon sun angling across the packed dirt around him and watched her go, and told himself it was purely the unusual nature of the last hour that was making him slow to follow. It was not purely the unusual nature of the last hour. Inside, she counted out the cash with the same precision she applied to everything else, placing each bill flat on the counter and noting the transaction in her ledger with quick, certain strokes. Nelson pocketed the money and did not immediately leave, which surprised him more than it probably surprised her, because she did not look surprised at all. "How long has Crane been giving you trouble?" he asked. Her pen paused above the ledger page. Then it continued its stroke, completing the line. "What makes you think he's been giving me trouble?" "The way he said your name," Nelson said. "Like he owned it." This made her still in a way that was different from her previous stillnesses, which had all been intentional and controlled. This one was involuntary, a brief and unguarded pause that told him he had landed closer to the truth than he had intended. She capped her ink bottle and set the pen in its holder. "Deputy Crane believes that this trading post would operate more smoothly with a man's name over the door," she said. "He has been of that opinion for approximately 2 years, since my father died and left the business to me. He expresses it in various ways, and I continue to operate the business exactly as I always have." Nelson looked around the trading post with new eyes. It was well organized and fully stocked, with shelves of dry goods, rope, ammunition, tools, and preserved food running the full length of the interior walls. A glass display case held pocket watches, combs, and small medicines. The scales on the counter were balanced and clearly calibrated. This was not a struggling or marginal operation. This was a successful, well-run business that a woman was maintaining alone in a town with a deputy who did not believe she had the right to do so. "What does he want?" Nelson asked. "Does he want to buy it?" "He wants me to sell it to his brother-in-law for a fraction of its worth," she said, with the flat, factual tone of someone who had long since exhausted her capacity for outrage on the subject and arrived at something harder and more durable. "I have declined this offer on 6 separate occasions. He has twice reported me to the county sheriff on fabricated charges, both times dismissed. He tried once to have my business license reviewed. That was also dismissed." She looked at Nelson directly. "I am still here." "I can see that," Nelson said. She picked up the ledger and moved toward the back storage room. "Your business is concluded, Mr. Hunter. I hope your drive goes smoothly." It was a dismissal, clear and courteous and complete, and Nelson recognized it as such, and he still stood at that counter for another moment before he did what any sensible man would have done and picked up his hat from the spot he had set it down and headed for the door. He made it to the porch. He made it down the 2 steps to the packed earth of the main street. He stood there in the warm evening air of a Caldwell spring, with $128 in his pocket and a cattle drive waiting for him north of Abilene, and the setting sun turning the dust haze above the rooftops orange and gold, and he thought about Vernon Crane's face when he had said Bessie Redmond's name. Then he went to the livery, arranged for his own horse to be stabled overnight, walked to the hotel on the opposite side of the street from the trading post, so that he could not see its windows from his room, and sat on the edge of the narrow hotel bed, and had a long, honest conversation with himself about exactly what he thought he was doing. The conversation did not produce satisfying answers. In the morning, he found out why. He was at the hotel's small dining room eating breakfast when one of the trading post's 2 hired hands, a young man of about 19 named Theo, came through the door at something close to a run and looked around the room with the wild-eyed urgency of someone delivering bad news. His gaze landed on Nelson with the desperation of a drowning man identifying a piece of floating timber. "You're the horse trader from yesterday," Theo said. "Hunter." Nelson set down his coffee cup. "Yes." Crane's men locked Miss Redmond out of the trading post this morning. They put a county seal on the door. She's around back trying to figure out if there's a way through the loading door, and she sent me to find Sheriff Briggs, but Briggs is 6 miles out at the Tanner farm on account of a dispute about a well, and I don't know who else to go to. Nelson was already pushing back from the table. He found Bessie exactly where Theo had described, at the rear of the trading post, studying the loading door with the concentrated focus of someone running calculations in their head. She was wearing the same dress as the day before, or one very similar, and her bonnet was slightly askew in a way that suggested she had put it on quickly and angrily. When she heard his boots on the alley ground, she turned, and for a fraction of a second he saw something on her face that he thought might have been relief before it disappeared back under the composed surface she kept facing the world. "Mr. Hunter," she said, "this isn't your concern. What grounds did he use? He says I've been operating without a properly renewed county license, which is a fabrication. I renewed in March. I have the documentation inside." She gestured at the sealed door. "Inside, which I cannot currently access." Nelson looked at the seal. It was official looking, bearing the county clerk's stamp, and removing it without legal authorization would itself be an offense. He looked at the front of the building from the alley, thinking about the layout he had observed yesterday. "Your office," he said. "Where is it relative to the street-facing windows?" She looked at him with sharp assessment. "Left side toward the back. Why? Is there a window in the office?" "Yes, it's small. It faces the alley on the north side." "Is it locked?" She was already moving before he finished the question, and he followed her around the north side of the building to a narrow alley space barely wide enough for a single person. The window was indeed small, set high in the wall, perhaps 18 inches wide and 12 inches tall. It was not locked. Bessie looked at it, looked at Nelson, and something entirely involuntary crossed her face that he decided generously to categorize as amusement. "I cannot fit through that window," she said. "I know," he said. "Tell me where the documentation is." Her expression sharpened again. "You want me to trust you to go through my office window and retrieve documents from my private files? You trusted me with your testimony yesterday when a deputy had a gun to my head," he said. "I figure that's probably a higher bar." She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "There's a blue pasteboard box on the middle shelf of the cabinet to the right of the desk. The renewal certificate will be in the folder marked March 1882 with the county clerk's raised seal." Getting through the window was not elegant. Nelson was not a small man, 6 feet and built solid through the shoulders from years of physical labor, and the window's small frame was not designed for access by adults of any size. He got his shoulders through by angling in sideways, dragged his hips through with a scrape of wood against belt buckle that was going to leave a mark, and dropped the 4 feet to the office floor with a thud that sent a small avalanche of pencils rolling off the desk. He found the cabinet, found the blue pasteboard box, found the March folder, and there was the certificate with its raised seal, solid and official and completely valid through the end of 1882. He also, because he was already there, and because it seemed useful, found the county regulations booklet on the same shelf and confirmed that the certification Bessie held was the correct one for her class of business. He passed both documents back through the window to her waiting hands, then extracted himself from the window with slightly more difficulty than he had gone in, arriving back in the narrow alley with a scuffed knee and a very small amount of dignity. She was already reading through the certificate with rapid, expert eyes. "This is everything I need," she said. "There's also this." He held out the regulations booklet with the relevant page marked with his finger, "in case anyone tries to argue about which certification applies to your type of operation." She took the booklet, read the marked passage, and looked up at him. In the thin morning light between the buildings, with her bonnet still slightly crooked, and her expression fully stripped of the careful professional composure she maintained in her post, she looked younger than he had initially assessed. He had placed her around 27 or 28. He revised downward toward 25. "Thank you," she said, and this time it was not said in the quick, deflective way she had said it yesterday. This time it landed with weight. "My pleasure," Nelson said, and he meant that too in a way that surprised him. They walked together to the county clerk's office, which occupied 2 rooms above the hardware store on the main street, and within 45 minutes the county seal had been removed from the trading post door, and a formal note had been placed on file documenting the improper action. The deputy clerk, a small nervous man named Foster who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, confirmed twice that the license was valid and apologized 3 times while doing so. On the steps of the hardware store, in the full morning sun with the trading post visible and open across the street, and Theo already propping back the front door with the cheerful energy of someone whose crisis had passed, Bessie Redmond turned and looked at Nelson Hunter with an expression he could not entirely read. "You're going to miss your cattle drive," she said. "I've missed cattle drives before. Why?" He thought about several different answers and discarded most of them, and settled on the one that felt most honest even if it was also most foolish. "Because when someone tells me 3 times in a row to leave something alone, I generally start to think there's a reason I shouldn't." She looked at him for a moment with those dark, almost black eyes that assessed everything and gave very little back. Then she said, "There's coffee at the trading post if you want it. I generally start the stove around 8, and it's usually drinkable by 8:15. Nelson told himself this was not an invitation. He told himself it was a practical courtesy extended to someone who had helped her out of a bind. He told himself that coffee was just coffee, and that he had a cattle drive to get to, and that a man who rode into a town for a quick trade and ended up staying past breakfast was the kind of man who accumulated the wrong kind of complications. He followed her across the street and drank her coffee, which was strong and slightly too bitter, and exactly the way he would have made it himself. Over the following 3 days, Nelson Hunter did not leave Caldwell. He told himself each morning that he would leave by afternoon. He told himself each afternoon that one more day could not significantly delay his arrival at the cattle drive, and that Caleb would manage without him for the first leg north, which was true. He told himself that the only reason he was still in town was that Vernon Crane had been conspicuously absent since the county clerk incident, and that conspicuous absence from a man who had twice filed false charges against someone was the kind of thing that deserved watching. He was lying to himself, and he knew it, and he went to the trading post every morning for coffee and stayed until noon helping Bessie with whatever needed doing, which on any given day might include mending a section of the back corral fence, organizing a supply delivery from the freight wagon, assisting with an inventory count, or simply sitting on the trading post porch while she kept her books and letting the morning go by in a way that felt, to Nelson's profound alarm, like something he wanted to repeat. They talked. That was the thing that undid him. Not the fact that she was striking, though she was, in the specific way of people whose faces are shaped by intelligence and stubbornness in equal measure. Not the fact that her competence was genuinely impressive, though it was. It was that she talked to him the way people rarely talk to anyone, directly and honestly and without performance, saying difficult things plainly and simple things without inflation, and listening when he spoke with the full and serious attention of someone who actually cared what the other person thought. He told her about Missouri and the cattle drives and the years of working for other men while he figured out what it was exactly he was working toward. She told him about her father, Edwin Redmond, who had built the trading post from a single-room operation in 1861 and expanded it piece by piece over 20 years, who had treated every trader and cowhand who came through his door with the same fair-handed respect regardless of their station, and who had never once suggested to his daughter that running a business was not something a woman was capable of. He had 3 options, she said one afternoon, sitting on an overturned crate in the back corral while Nelson repaired a section of fence post that had been listing badly for a month according to Theo. He could leave the post to me, sell it to someone else, or close it. He chose to leave it to me because he believed I was the most qualified person to run it. She said this without false modesty and without bravado, simply as a fact that she had long since made her peace with. Some people in this town have never fully recovered from that choice. Like Crane. Crane is the loudest one, she said. He's not the only one. There's a certain kind of man who finds a woman running her own business to be a personal affront, even when it has no effect on his own livelihood whatsoever. She pulled a loose thread from the hem of her sleeve and discarded it. I find it useful to treat that kind of opinion the same way I treat bad weather. I make appropriate preparations, I don't take it personally, and I wait for it to pass. What if it doesn't pass? Nelson said. She was quiet for a moment. Then I find a different road. That evening, for the first time, Nelson did not leave when the trading post closed. Bessie had mentioned at noon that she had a supper problem, which was that the woman who usually brought her meals from the hotel kitchen had taken ill, and that cooking supper herself was not something she particularly objected to, but that it used time she did not currently have, given that she was trying to complete a quarterly account reconciliation before the week ended. Nelson had said, with a casualness that he hoped was convincing, that he had cooked over a trail fire for the better part of a decade, and that supper was not beyond his abilities. What resulted was a simple meal of salt pork and corned bread and dried apple that he put together in the small kitchen attached to the back of the trading post, while Bessie worked at the table with her ledgers, and the oil lamp casting warm yellow light across the columns of figures she was adding up. The domestic ordinariness of the scene struck Nelson with a force that was almost physical. He had not shared a kitchen with another human being in so long that the simple act of hearing someone else move papers around a table while he cooked felt like something he had not known he was hungry for. They ate at the kitchen table. She told him about a particularly complex trade dispute she had mediated the previous month between a cattle rancher and a Wichita freight company, the terms of which had required her to personally translate 3 documents and draft 2 letters to the county courthouse, all of which she had managed without a lawyer and without a fee. He told her about a midnight stampede during a 79 drive along the Kishom that had cost him his best horse and nearly his left hand. After supper, she poured 2 small glasses of whiskey from a bottle she kept in the pantry and set them on the table, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight and talked for 2 more hours about things that had nothing whatsoever to do with horses or trading licenses or the cattle drive north of Abilene, until the oil lamp burned low and Bessie looked up from the middle of a sentence and said, with the same plain directness she applied to everything, "Nelson, what are you doing here?" He looked at her across the table in the low light. "I've been asking myself that same question," he said, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't have a good answer yet, but I'm not sure that's a reason to stop looking for one." She held his gaze for a long beat, and whatever she saw in it did not send her running, which told him something, and then she looked down at her whiskey glass and said, "You should know that I am not a woman who is looking for someone to take care of her." "I know that," he said. "I've had several days to observe that directly. And I am not going to sell this trading post or leave this town because a man wants me to go somewhere that suits him better. I haven't asked you to do any of those things." "No," she said, "you haven't." She turned the whiskey glass slowly in her hands. "That's why I'm telling you." He understood what she was saying. She was telling him the terms of whatever this was before it became anything, clearing the ground so there would be no misunderstanding later. It was, he thought, precisely the kind of thing that a woman who ran a successful business alone at 25 said when she met a man who was making her want to trust him, and was also quite plainly not a man who had any particular address. "I appreciate that," he said. "Good." She drained the last of her whiskey with a decisive tilt of the glass. "Then we understand each other." He rode back to the hotel that night and lay on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling and thought about addresses. On the 4th morning, Vernon Crane came back. Nelson was on the trading post porch drinking his morning coffee and reading a week-old Wichita newspaper when Crane came up the main street with two other men whose manner and dress marked them as hired hands, not deputies. They stopped in front of the trading post in a line, and Crane looked at Nelson on the porch with an expression that had moved past irritation into something darker. "Hunter," he said, "I thought you were leaving." "Changed my mind," Nelson said, folding the newspaper precisely. "What business you got here anymore? You completed your trade." "I have a cup of coffee on this porch," Nelson said pleasantly, "and a chair that suits me, and no particular obligation to justify either one to a county deputy who spends his working hours harassing business owners on fabricated pretenses." The muscle in Crane's jaw jumped. One of the men beside him, a blocky individual with a red beard, shifted his weight in a way that was meant to be noticed. "I'm going to need to inspect the premises," Crane said, "on behalf of the County Fire Safety Board." "Do you have a written order from the fire board?" Crane's eyes narrowed. "I don't need a written order for a routine inspection." "Under the 1878 Kansas Commercial Premises Code," said a voice from the doorway behind Nelson, and he did not turn around because he recognized the voice immediately. "Routine fire safety inspections require 48 hours written notice unless there is a documented immediate hazard. Do you have documentation of an immediate hazard, Vernon?" Bessie stepped out onto the porch beside Nelson, holding a thin book that he recognized as the county regulations booklet from her office, already open to the relevant section. She held it out toward Crane. "Page 41, she said, "if you'd like to verify." Crane stared at the two of them standing side by side on her porch, and his expression underwent a slow and ugly transformation that moved through frustration, calculation, and arrived at a kind of cold malice that was more instructive than anything he had said or done. "You've got yourself a watchdog," he said to Bessie, with a deliberate contempt that was intended to demean them both. "I've got myself a quiet morning," she said, "which I would like to continue. Goodbye, Vernon." She turned and went back inside without waiting to see what he would do, and Nelson sat back down in his chair and picked up his newspaper. And after a long, simmering moment, Crane turned his horse and rode back down the street with his two hired men trailing behind. Nelson sat on the porch until his coffee was cold, thinking about what the deputy's face had looked like in that last moment. There was something there that went beyond professional obstruction or simple misogyny. There was a specific, personal anger that suggested the situation between Crane and Bessie Redmond was more complicated than a business dispute. He went inside and found Bessie behind the counter, serving a customer with complete equanimity, as though the scene on the porch had already been filed away and dealt with. He waited until the customer left, then leaned on the counter in the way he had discovered on the first day that she tolerated without comment, which was itself a form of permission. "How long has he actually been doing this?" Nelson said. "And I mean the full account, not the edited version." She looked at him for a moment with the assessing look that he had started to recognize as genuine consideration rather than deflection. Then she said, "Walk with me. Theo can manage the front." They walked out the back of the trading post and into the rear yard, where the horses he had sold stood in the corral looking peaceable and well-fed. She stopped at the fence and rested her forearms on the top rail, looking out at the animals. "My father died in November of 1880, she said. 18 months later, in the spring of 1881, Crane's brother-in-law, a man named Dale Pritchard, made the first offer on the trading post. At the time, Pritchard was already acquiring 3 other properties on the south end of town, and the offer he made was for about 60% of what the post was actually worth. I declined." She paused. "The following month, Crane filed the first false charge with the county sheriff, claiming I had sold goods imported from a prohibited vendor. It was dismissed within a week. Then came the license review. Then the second false charge, this one alleging that I had miscounted bonded goods, also dismissed. Those are expensive tactics even when they're dismissed," Nelson said. "They take your time and energy." "That's the point," she said without any heat. "The The goal isn't to win the legal argument. The goal is to make operating this business costly enough, exhausting enough, that eventually I decide it isn't worth it and take whatever offer Pritchard puts on the table. She picked up a small stone from the fence post and turned it in her fingers. What they didn't account for is that I am extremely stubborn. Nelson almost smiled. I had noticed that. She glanced at him sideways, and there was something in that sidelong glance that was different from her usual direct assessments. Softer, more aware of him as a person and less as a situation to be evaluated. She looked back at the horses quickly. "The reason it's personal for Crane," she said, "is that before my father died, Crane came to him directly and suggested that once he was gone, Crane himself might be in a position to help run the trading post. As a husband." She said the word with a precision that communicated its full weight of irony. "My father told him politely that the trading post would be in good hands without any assistance. Crane did not take that well." Nelson was quiet for a moment. "He proposed to you. He proposed to the trading post," she said flatly. "I was incidental to the arrangement, which was the main problem with it from my perspective." Nelson stood at the fence beside her in the morning sun, and the anger that moved through him at this accounting was quiet and thorough in the way of emotions that have a solid moral foundation. He did not let it show because it was not, strictly speaking, his anger to display. "Does Sheriff Briggs know the full picture?" he said. "Briggs is a decent man who is stretched thin across a large county and who has been dealing with Crane long enough to be tired of him," she said. "He believes me when I bring him documentation. He does not, on his own initiative, go looking for reasons to discipline his deputy." Nelson thought about this. He thought about Bessie in this town for 2 years, alone, managing a successful business and a harassment campaign simultaneously, maintaining her composure with the kind of deep-rooted endurance that most people never had to develop because they had other people to share the weight. He thought about the way she had stood in the trading post with a gun at someone else's head and spoken with complete authority and not a tremor. He thought about the fact that he had a cattle drive to get to and a life with no fixed address, and that none of this was his problem to solve. "I think," he said carefully, "that what would be most useful is for Crane to understand that you are not alone. Not because you need someone to fight your battles, but because the calculus changes when there's a witness who isn't going anywhere." She turned to look at him then directly, with no sidelong softness this time, and there was something complex and honest in her expression that he thought might be the closest she had come to being fully unguarded with him. "How long are you proposing to stay?" she asked. "As long as I'm useful," he said. Then more honestly, possibly longer than that. The silence between them was the kind that has weight and texture. That means something is being said without words being used. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she picked up the stone she had been turning in her fingers and set it carefully on the top fence rail. "I will not ask you to give up the cattle drive on my account," she said. "You haven't asked me for anything," he said. "That's more or less the problem." She looked at the fence rail, at the stone she had placed there, and he watched the very slight shift in her expression that he was beginning to recognize as the moment when she was making a decision. "The Hutchinson freight route comes through at the end of the month," she said. "I could use help taking inventory of the incoming stock. It's a 2-day job and the freight company is particular about how the transfer is documented." She looked at him. "If you're still here." "I'll still be here," he said. He went back to the hotel that afternoon and wrote a letter to Caleb, explaining that he was delayed and would rejoin the drive when he could. And he paid for another week at the hotel. And he sat on the narrow bed and acknowledged to himself, fully and without qualification, that he was falling in love with Bessie Redmond, and that this was the most alarming and simultaneously the most right-feeling thing that had happened to him in 31 years. The week that followed was the best week Nelson Hunter had had in longer than he could clearly account for. He settled into a rhythm with Bessie that felt, for all its recency, like something established and known. mornings at the trading post with coffee and the newspaper, and whatever work presented itself. Afternoons that sometimes brought customers and sometimes brought logistical problems, and once brought a complicated dispute between a local rancher and a Cheyenne trader that Bessie navigated with a patience and fairness that left both parties satisfied and Nelson privately astounded. Evenings that more and more often ended with supper in the kitchen, and whiskey at the table and conversation that ranged across terrain neither of them had expected to cover with another person. He learned that she had been educated at a women's academy in Topeka before returning to Caldwell to help her father, and that she read voraciously, and that she had strong opinions about land rights and a particular contempt for practices that stripped small operators of their autonomy through legal manipulation. He learned that she had 2 distant cousins in Missouri and no close family remaining. He learned that she was afraid of exactly one thing, which was not Vernon Crane and not financial ruin, and not the general hostility of a certain kind of man, but something quieter and more fundamental. The fear that the life she had built for herself, piece by careful piece, would eventually require her to choose between the business that was her father's legacy and her own heart. He learned this the night she told him, and he understood exactly what she meant by it, because he was the person who was creating that potential choice and they both knew it. He did not tell her he was falling in love with her. He thought she already knew, and he thought she was carefully not responding to it yet because she was precisely the kind of person who needed to be sure before she moved. He respected this. He also found it extremely difficult to maintain with any consistency, because being around Bessie Redmond had rewired something in him that he had not known was capable of rewiring, and what he felt for her was not the passing infatuation of a man who had been on the trail too long but something structural and permanent, like a beam that had been set and was now load-bearing. On the 8th day, Crane made his final move. Nelson was at the livery checking on his horse when Theo came running again, and this time the boy's face was pale enough that Nelson was moving before the words were out. 2 men broke the back window of the trading post, and there, inside, "Miss Redmond is in there and she won't come out," and I heard shouting. Nelson covered the distance to the trading post at a run, came through the front door without pausing, and found the back storage room occupied by Bessie and 2 men he did not recognize, one of whom was holding a heavy ledger that he had clearly pulled from the shelf, and the other of whom was standing between Bessie and the door in a posture that was intended to prevent her from leaving. "I told you to set that down," Bessie was saying, in the controlled, exact voice that he was beginning to understand she used specifically when she was furious. "Pritchard's got a legal claim on this inventory," the man with the ledger said. "We're here to assess it." "Pritchard has no legal claim on any part of this property," Bessie said, "and the 2 of you are trespassing. Get out." Nelson stepped into the storage room doorway, and the energy in the space changed immediately. The man with the ledger looked at him. The man blocking the door looked at him. Both of them made the rapid masculine assessment of someone encountering an unknown variable and arriving at the conclusion that the variable was not in their favor. "Put the ledger down," Nelson said. He kept his voice level. He did not touch his holster. He did not need to. The ledger went down. The 2 men left, pushing past him with the brittle dignity of people who had decided that this particular situation was not worth further investment. Nelson turned to Bessie, who was standing in the middle of her storage room with her arms crossed and the controlled fury still tight across her features, and he looked at her for a moment and said the thing he had been not saying for 8 days. "I'm not leaving." She looked at him. "I mean that generally," he said, "not just tonight. I don't know exactly what that looks like or how we build it or whether it's what you want, but I am telling you directly that I am not a man who wants to keep moving, and I have not wanted to keep moving since approximately 3 hours after I rode into this town, and I think you know why." She was very still. "I own this trading post," she said. "I know that. I am not going to marry someone and hand it over to them to run." "I know that too," he said. "That's not what I'm asking for." I don't know a great deal about running a trading post, but I can do what needs doing and I learn fast, and I will take whatever role in this operation that you decide is appropriate, which might be fixing fence posts and loading freight wagons for the rest of my natural life. And I will be satisfied with that because the fence posts are here and you are here. She looked at him with the full force of that dark-eyed assessment, the one that saw through things to what they actually were, and he stood in it without flinching because there was nothing in what he had said that he needed to hide. "Nelson," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name without the surname, and it sounded different, closer. "I have been falling in love with you since you climbed through my office window." He crossed the storage room and kissed her, and she kissed him back with the same direct, unperformative honesty that she applied to everything, and it was considerably more overwhelming than he had expected, which was saying something, because he had been thinking about kissing her for the better part of a week. When they separated, she had both hands flat against his chest and was looking up at him with an expression that was new, one he had not seen before, open and unguarded in a way that told him she did not show it often, and it did something to him that no amount of plain language was going to adequately describe. "I want to be clear," she said, slightly breathless, "that this changes nothing about how the business is run." "Absolutely nothing," he agreed. The matter of Vernon Crane and Dale Pritchard did not resolve itself on sentiment alone, which was unsurprising, because neither Crane nor Pritchard were the kind of men moved by sentiment. What resolved it was thorough documentation, the firm attention of Sheriff Briggs once the full pattern had been laid out for him across 2 sessions in the sheriff's office, and a letter from a Topeka attorney whom Bessie contacted after the storage room break-in, which constituted criminal trespass and provided the legal hook that had been missing from all the previous incidents. Nelson sat in both meetings with the sheriff and contributed what he had witnessed directly. His account added to Bessie's records and Theo's testimony to construct an account that Briggs could not dismiss as isolated incidents. The sheriff, looking older and more tired than any man ought to look at midday, reviewed the documents that Bessie spread across his desk and was quiet for a long time. "I've known Vernon was crooked," Briggs said finally. "I didn't know how crooked." "Now you do," Bessie said. "Crane was suspended from his deputy duties pending a county review within the week. Pritchard was formally warned against any further contact with the trading post or its operations, and faced a criminal trespass charge that he ultimately settled by paying damages, which Bessie put directly into the trading post's repair fund with characteristic practicality. The town of Caldwell absorbed these events the way frontier towns absorbed most things, loudly for a few days, and then with a kind of collective readjustment toward the new normal. Some people expressed surprise that Crane had been removed. More people expressed that they had long suspected something of the sort. Several of the town's business people, who had watched Bessie manage her operation for 2 years, and had their own quiet opinions about the deputy's behavior, stopped by the trading post over the following days to speak to her directly in ways they had not done before, which Bessie accepted without fanfare and without gloating. Nelson spent those days working. He had always been a man who processed his internal states through physical labor, and there was plenty to do. The broken window was repaired. The fence post that had been listing for a month was fully reset. He helped organize the Hutchinson freight delivery at the end of the month, a 2-day operation that he threw himself into with the complete focus of someone who genuinely wanted to prove that his usefulness extended beyond arriving at crises. Bessie watched him during those 2 days with the attentive, slightly bemused look of someone recalibrating an expectation, and on the second evening, sitting on the loading dock with the last of the freight inventory checked and logged and a cup of cold coffee each, she said, "You're good at this. I told you I learned fast. You have an instinct for organization," she said, in the assessing tone she used for genuine observation. "You see the whole pattern of a task rather than just the piece in front of you. That's not a learned skill, that's a way of thinking." He considered this. I suppose 10 years of moving cattle across 500 miles teaches you to think about systems. It does, she said. It also teaches you to be comfortable with uncertainty, which is useful here. She looked at the loaded shelves through the open storage room door. Freight schedules change. Traders come late or not at all. Prices shift between 1 week and the next. You have to be able to hold the whole picture loosely and still make decisions. That's a fair description of most things worth doing, he said. She smiled, and it was the smile that she did not often produce for general audiences, the one that reached her eyes and changed her whole face into something that made his chest contract with a warmth he had stopped trying to categorize. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask? What were you planning before Caldwell, before you changed your mind about leaving?" He thought about this honestly. "I was planning to keep moving," he said. "There was always another drive, another trade, another place to be. I told myself I was building towards something, saving money, figuring out what I wanted. But the truth is I had been doing that for long enough that it had become a habit rather than a plan. And now." He looked at her in the evening light, with the smell of hay and new timber around them, and the town of Caldwell going quiet and domestic in the distance. "Now I know what I want," he said. "Which is considerably simpler and considerably more terrifying than anything I was doing before." She leaned her shoulder against his, lightly, deliberately, and they sat like that for a while without speaking, and it was the kind of quiet that is not empty but full. 3 weeks after Nelson Hunter had ridden into Caldwell for a quick trade, he asked Bessie Redmond to marry him. He did it in the kitchen, after supper, with no orchestration and no particular setup, because elaborate orchestration was not something that suited either of them, and the moment arrived in the way that genuine moments do, organically, out of a conversation about the future of the trading post and what expansion might look like in 3 years. He had been talking about the possibility of adding a small livestock operation to the back acreage, which Bessie owned outright, and the conversation had moved naturally into the territory of long-term planning, and he had looked at her across the kitchen table and said, "None of this makes sense unless we're building it together. And I want to build it together. I want to marry you, Bessie, if that's something you're willing to consider." She put down her pen. She looked at him. "You understand exactly what that means in terms of this business," she said. "The business remains yours," he said. "Your name stays on it. Your decisions run it. I am a partner in the enterprise of our life together, not the head of your professional operation." She looked at him for a long, serious moment. Then she said, "Yes." It came out simply, without ceremony, and it was the most direct and certain thing he had ever heard in his life. They were married 6 weeks later, in the small Methodist church 2 streets from the trading post, by a minister named Reverend Aldrich who had known Bessie's father, and who kept the ceremony practical and warm in equal measure. Theo and his mother were there, and 3 of the town's business people who had become genuine supporters, and Sheriff Briggs, who arrived in his Sunday coat looking like a man who had decided the occasion merited the effort. Nelson wore his best shirt, which was clean and pressed, and which Bessie had looked at that morning with the small sideways smile she reserved for things she found both acceptable and slightly amusing. She wore a dress the color of deep blue, practical enough for the frontier but clearly made with care, with her dark hair unpinned for the occasion, and falling in a way that Nelson thought he might spend considerable time thinking about for the rest of his life. Reverend Aldrich read from the scripture and offered a brief and genuine blessing, and they said their vows with the plain directness that characterized everything between them. And when it was over and they walked out of the church into the Caldwell noon sun, Nelson Hunter felt the particular, profound settling of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was looking for. Life in Caldwell as a married couple had a texture that surprised Nelson by its richness. The trading post filled his days with work that was endlessly varied, dealing with the livestock assessments, freight logistics, and the careful system building that Bessie had identified as his particular strength. She continued to run the business as she always had, making the decisions and maintaining the relationships that were the post's foundation, and he slotted into the operation with a completeness that neither of them had entirely predicted, though Bessie, when he mentioned this, said simply that she had predicted it, which was characteristic. They argued sometimes, as people who are both intelligent and stubborn inevitably do, about the operation of the business and the allocation of resources, and once, memorably, about the most efficient way to organize the ammunition inventory, which was a disagreement that lasted 3 days and was ultimately resolved in Bessie's favor because she was correct. Nelson conceded this with good grace, which she acknowledged with the particular soft expression that she held only for him. In the evenings they read, or talked, or sat in the compatible silence that couples achieve when they know each other well enough not to need to fill every moment with words. Bessie was reading her way through a collection of legal and commercial texts that she had ordered from a bookseller in Kansas City, building a knowledge base she described as useful preparation for the future. Nelson was reading a natural history text that he had found in the Trading Post's miscellaneous goods shelf, about the flora and fauna of the Central Plains, which he had started reading for practical purposes, and continued because it was genuinely interesting. The fall of 1882 brought the first cold weather, and with it a substantial increase in trade, as ranchers and homesteaders made their final preparations before winter. The Trading Post had its best quarter since Bessie's father had run it, a fact that she recorded in her ledger with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has worked for something and seen it bear out. Nelson watched her note the final figure and felt a pride so complete it nearly embarrassed him. "This is your doing," he said. "It's both of ours," she said, setting down her pen with a firmness that closed the subject. In the spring of 1883, Bessie told him she was expecting a child. She delivered this information in the morning, before the Trading Post opened, with a directness that he had come to cherish as entirely her own, and he stood in the kitchen for a moment with the weight of it moving through him before he crossed to where she stood and held her, his face against her hair, without words, because words were not what the moment needed. Their son was born that October, a healthy boy they named Edwin after Bessie's father, with dark eyes that were clearly going to be his mother's, and a disposition that announced itself from the first week as determined and particular, and not easily redirected, which Nelson observed with a complex mix of sympathy and delight. Having a child in the Trading Post changed the rhythms of their life without disrupting its foundations, which was the thing Nelson had been privately watching for, the way that a new weight could shift a structure that had been built for a different load. What he found instead was that Bessie absorbed the change with the same adaptive pragmatism she brought to everything, reorganizing the Trading Post's back office into a space that could accommodate both her bookkeeping and Edwin's early months, and that the rhythm of their days bent and reformed around the new shape without breaking. Edwin grew with the Trading Post as backdrop and context, learning to crawl among the boots of traders and drovers who came through, charming everyone who came into contact with him with the unself-conscious social confidence of a child who has never been made to feel that his presence is inconvenient. By the time he was walking, he was conducting what appeared to be extremely serious negotiations with the Trading Post's cat, a large orange animal named Commodore, who tolerated the child with the weary dignity of someone who has made peace with his circumstances. Nelson spent those early years building the livestock operation he had proposed before he and Bessie were married, a small but well-managed herd that used the back acreage efficiently and produced both a direct income and a supply of stock for the Trading Post's horse trade. It was hard work in a way that was different from trail driving, less constantly mobile and more demanding of the patient, systematic attention that he had been developing since his arrival in Caldwell, and he found that it suited him, that the daily rhythms of the land and the animals were something he had been missing without knowing it. Caldwell continued its own evolution through these years. The cattle trade that had defined the town's early economy began to shift as the railheads moved, and the open range became increasingly fenced, and businesses that had been built purely on the cattle boom adjusted or did not. Redmond's trading post adjusted, diversifying its goods and its customer base, building relationships with the growing homesteader population that was spreading across the Cherokee Strip country as land became available, and maintaining the reputation for fair and straight dealing that Edwin Redmond had built and that his daughter had defended through considerable adversity. The matter of Vernon Crane had an ending that was, by frontier standards, almost anticlimactic. He lost his deputy's position after the county review, as expected, and subsequently left Caldwell for some unspecified destination to the south, his departure noted by the town with the same collective readjustment it applied to most things. Dale Pritchard, deprived of his most aggressive advocate, and facing the evidence that Bessie Redmond was not leaving and was not selling, ultimately sold his own properties on Caldwell's South End and moved on to other schemes in other places. The trading post's existence no longer required defending. In 1885, they expanded the trading post building itself, adding a second room on the north side that allowed the livestock supplies and the dry goods to be separated, improving the organization and the customer experience simultaneously. Nelson designed the expansion and supervised the construction with the help of a local builder named Garrett and Theo, who had by this point grown into a young man of genuine competence and had been formally hired as the post's full-time assistant manager. Bessie handled the permits and the financing with the efficiency that characterized everything she did. The night the new room was finished, they walked through it together, their boots loud on the fresh-laid floor, the smell of new pine boards sharp in the evening air. Edwin, who was 2 years old and mobile and had strong opinions about things, was asleep at home with Theo's mother watching him, and the trading post was quiet and theirs in the way it sometimes was in the evenings, full of the presence of the day's work and the promise of the next day's work and the larger shape of what they were building together. "Your father would have liked this," Nelson said. She ran her hand along the new shelving and was quiet for a moment. "He would have liked you," she said. He valued people who did what they said they would do. She looked at Nelson across the new room in the way she had of looking at him when she was saying something that mattered more than the words alone. "You told me you weren't leaving. You haven't left." "No," he said, "I haven't." She crossed the new room and stopped in front of him and put her palm flat against his chest, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood in the finished room of the trading post that she had built and he had helped expand, and that belonged to both of them now in every way that counted. "I love you," she said. She said it in the same plain, direct way she said everything, without ornament and without inflation, and it landed with all the weight of a thing that is completely true. "I love you," he said. He meant it in exactly the same way, and she knew it, and that was enough. Their second child arrived in 1887, a daughter they named Clara, who was born with Nelson's lighter coloring and her mother's eyes, and an expression of thoughtful evaluation that Bessie said she recognized immediately, and Nelson said was the most alarming thing he had ever seen on a newborn. Clara grew up watchful and precise, where Edwin grew up social and bold, and the two of them together filled the trading post and the house behind it with a noise and energy that Nelson, who had spent the better part of a decade in the large, bleak silence of the open trail, found to be one of the most consistently surprising pleasures of his life. Edwin had inherited his grandfather's name and his mother's precision with numbers. By the time he was 7, he was helping Theo with the inventory counts, moving through the shelves with a small ledger of his own, and a pencil that he gripped with considerable seriousness. Bessie watched this with an expression of complex, layered emotion that Nelson had learned to recognize as the particular look she wore when something touched the part of her she kept most carefully guarded. "He's going to run this place eventually," Nelson said one evening, watching Edwin through the trading post window as the boy conducted an extremely earnest conversation with a settler about the quality of a rope. "He might," Bessie said. "Or Clara might. Or neither of them, and we'll find someone." She looked at the window. "The point isn't who runs it after us. The point is that we built it so that it can be passed on, so that it continues." Nelson thought about Edwin Redmond, whom he had never met, who had built a trading post from a single room and left it to a daughter he trusted absolutely. He thought about what it meant to build something with enough integrity that it outlasted you, that it continued to do good work in the world long after your particular contribution to it had ended. "Your father did that right," he said. "He did," she agreed. "I'm trying to do the same." She was succeeding. The trading post in 1888 was a different operation in scale from the one Nelson had first walked into in 1882, but it was recognizably the same enterprise in character, honest and fair and well-run, known across a widening territory for the quality of its goods and the reliability of its transactions. Redmond's had become the kind of institution that a town builds its identity around, not grandly or loudly but quietly and durably, the way water builds a canyon. Nelson had become, over those years, a man with an address that was also a home, which was a thing he had not known how to be and had learned from the ground up, imperfectly, and with Bessie's patient and frequently plain-spoken guidance. He was known in Caldwell as fair and capable and inclined toward understatement, which were the things he had always been, but he was also known as Bessie Redmond's husband, and he wore that particular identity with a pride that was entirely without complication. He thought sometimes about the man he had been riding into Caldwell in the spring of 1882, with 4 horses and no particular destination, and the traveling habit of a decade worn deep into his bones. He thought about sitting on the edge of that narrow hotel bed on the first night, telling himself he was staying for practical reasons, and knowing even then that the practical reasons were a story he was telling himself about something else entirely. He thought about climbing through a small office window with the clumsy determination of a man who had already decided something without formally admitting it to himself. In the fall of 1888, Nelson turned 37. Bessie gave him a new pair of leather-bound ledger books for the livestock operation, because she was Bessie and practical gifts were a form of love in her language, and she gave him also a long evening alone on the porch of the house they had built on the land behind the trading post, in a good chair with a glass of whiskey, and the October stars doing what the October stars did on clear Kansas evenings, which was to render everything that seemed complicated into something simpler. She joined him after the children were in bed, sitting beside him in the matching chair that had been a wedding present from the town's furniture maker, and they sat in the starlit quiet with the warmth from the house at their backs and the vast dark of the prairie spreading out before them, and Nelson thought that there was no version of his life in any direction he might have ridden from any point in the previous decade that would have arrived somewhere better than here. "Are you warm enough?" she asked. "More than," he said. She reached over and took his hand, and he held hers, and the stars turned slowly overhead in the way they had been doing since long before either of them existed and would continue doing long after. And it was, Nelson Hunter thought, exactly right. Edwin and Clara grew up in the trading post the way children in good places grow up, absorbing the rhythms and values of the work around them without being told explicitly what those values were. Edwin, by the time he was 12, could negotiate a straight trade without supervision, and kept his own set of accounts for a small side enterprise he had established selling fishing tackle he made himself to passing drovers, a business his mother assessed with professional approval, and his father watched with the private delight of someone seeing a pattern repeat itself in the best possible way. Clara at 9 was already reading through her mother's legal and commercial texts with a focused intensity that concerned Nelson slightly and made Bessie visibly satisfied. "She's going to want more than Caldwell eventually," Bessie said once, watching Clara through the window. "That's all right. We'll make sure she has what she needs to go where she wants to go." "Is that not frightening?" Nelson asked. "Terrifying. Bessie said immediately. "I'm doing it anyway." In 1890, Caldwell entered a period of economic adjustment as the cattle drives that had originally sustained it finally dwindled to a fraction of their former volume, replaced by the railroad routes that moved cattle to market without the long overland drives that had defined the trail era. The town's character shifted, and businesses that had not evolved struggled. Redmond's trading post, which Bessie had been diversifying for the better part of 5 years in anticipation of precisely this shift, handled the transition better than most. The homesteader trade that she had been building relationships with since the mid-80s provided a stable base, and the livestock operation Nelson ran had developed its own reputation and customer base that was independent of the cattle drive economy. Nelson rode out twice that year with a string of horses to trade at other posts to the north and west, operations that lasted several weeks, and that took him away from Caldwell with a regularity that he accepted as necessary, but that he found, each time, increasingly difficult to reconcile with the straightforward reality that he would rather be home. Coming back from the second of those trips in late October, he rode into Caldwell in the early morning before the town was fully awake, and he put his horse in the livery and walked down the main street with his saddlebags over one shoulder and the familiar smell of the town around him. That particular mixture of dust and cook fires and horses and milled lumber that belonged only here. And when he came around the back of the trading post and through the yard gate and saw the light already in the kitchen window, he stopped for a moment. He thought about a man who had ridden into a town on a Tuesday morning for a quick trade and had left, 3 weeks later, carrying something that had nothing to do with horses and that could not be sold or counted, and that had turned out to be the most significant cargo he had ever transported, which was the knowledge that a particular woman existed in the world and that he was incapable of thinking about anything else. He went inside. Bessie was at the kitchen table with her morning coffee and her ledger, and she looked up when the door opened with the expression she wore when she was expecting him but had not been sure of the exact timing, which was the expression he associated with the particular, subdued relief she allowed herself when he came home. "You're early," she said. "Pushed the last 2 days," he said. "I wanted to be here." She held out her hand across the table, and he sat down and took it, and the morning light came through the kitchen window, and the coffee was on the stove, and Edwin's voice could be heard somewhere in the interior of the house engaged in what sounded like a negotiation with his sister, and Nelson Hunter was home. The years that followed were good ones, marked by the steady accumulation of the things that constitute a life well built. Edwin grew tall and capable, and eventually did, in fact, take over the day-to-day operation of the livestock side of the business, working alongside his father with a partnership that developed its own language and rhythms. Clara, at 16, announced that she wanted to study law in Topeka, a declaration that Bessie heard with entirely unsurprised equanimity, and that Nelson heard with a pride so large it took him several days to find words for. "She gets it from you," he told Bessie. "She gets it from herself," Bessie said, which was the correct answer and the one he had been expecting. Clara went to Topeka in 1903, when she was 16, to a women's college that Bessie had been corresponding with for 2 years, laying the groundwork with the patient, systematic thoroughness she brought to every important task. She wrote letters home twice a month, long, detailed, somewhat combative letters that were full of legal theory and philosophical argument, and occasional extremely funny observations about her fellow students, and Bessie read them at the kitchen table with complete absorption and replied with equal thoroughness. Edwin married a woman named Ruth in 1905, a rancher's daughter from a property 8 miles outside town, who had her own clear-eyed assessment of the world and who matched Edwin's social warmth with a practical steadiness that Nelson thought was, in the best possible way, familiar. They settled in Caldwell and became part of the trading post operation, and the house behind the post became the kind of place that contains multiple generations, full of noise and life, and the ongoing argument about the best way to run a livestock operation that Nelson and Edwin conducted with affectionate vigor across most of their shared working life. On a clear spring morning in 1907, 25 years after Nelson Hunter had ridden into Caldwell for a quick horse trade, he stood at the trading post counter and watched Bessie hand a receipt to a homesteader whose family he knew and whose father had been trading with Redmonds since before Edwin and Clara were born. The homesteader tucked the receipt into his pocket and said, as people had been saying for 25 years, that you couldn't do better than Redmonds for a straight trade, and Bessie said what she always said, which was that she appreciated the business and hoped to continue earning it, and the homesteader tipped his hat and went out into the morning. Bessie turned from the counter and found Nelson watching her, and she looked at him with the expression she wore for him, the one that was different from every other expression she possessed, layered and warm and completely unguarded. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything's fine." She came around the counter and stopped in front of him and looked up at him in the way she had been looking up at him for 25 years, with those dark brown, almost black eyes that saw through everything to what it actually was. 25 years, she said. 25 years, he agreed. "Are you satisfied?" she asked, in the slightly testing tone she sometimes used when she wanted a real answer. He looked at the trading post around him, at the walls that held the history of everything they had built, at the door through which 30 years' worth of traders and drovers and homesteaders and neighbors had come and gone, at the window where the Caldwell morning light fell in the particular golden slant of spring. He looked at the woman standing in front of him who had sent a deputy backing down with a regulations booklet and a steady voice, who had kept a business alive through 2 years of deliberate obstruction, who had told him exactly what her terms were before she let herself love him, and had kept every one of those terms without compromise, who had raised 2 extraordinary children and built a life that was rooted and permanent, and that he had been part of for all of its best years. "More than satisfied," he said. She reached up and put her hand against his cheek the way she sometimes did, and he covered her hand with his. And outside the trading post the town of Caldwell went about its morning business, and the horses in the back corral moved in the easy way of well-kept animals, and somewhere in the house behind the post Edwin's son, who was 4 years old and had just recently begun to make extremely serious inspections of the trading post's inventory, was probably already terrorizing Commodore's successor. A cat named Admiral who had the same weary dignity as his predecessor. "I rode into this town for a quick trade," Nelson said. "You did," she agreed. "I want the record to show that I consider the outcome superior." She smiled, and it was the smile she had been giving him for 25 years, the one that reached her eyes and changed her whole face, and she said, "The record so notes." Then she stepped back and picked up the ledger she had set on the counter and said, with the practical directness that was the most Bessie thing about her, "There's a freight delivery at noon, and I need you to check the stock count before it arrives." "Yes, ma'am," Nelson said. He pulled on his coat and went to work, and the trading post opened its doors to the Caldwell morning, and everything was exactly as it should be, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.